So my name is David Gross. I'm a tax resistance counselor with the National War Tax Resistance Coordinating Committee, and today I'm going to give you a brief overview of what really is kind of a complex and crazy topic. And I'm going to try to lay everything out so it's really easy for people to understand and for you to understand how you can get started in tax resistance yourself. Okay, first off, this is going to be recorded, and this is including the question and answer session we're going to hold at the end. Another disclaimer is that I'm not an accountant, a financial advisor, or a lawyer. I can't give you investment, financial planning advice, legal advice, instructions on how to file your taxes correctly, and this presentation isn't any of those things. It's going to include some information about tax filing and about the historical experience of tax filing, but it's not a replacement for going to a tax professional. Some of the methods of tax resistance that I'm going to talk about today are not legal. And you need to be aware of that some of these are civil disobedience, and so there are consequences of that. Not all of them are, but some of them are. Also, I'm going to be talking a lot about what our historical experience has been going up against the government in tax resistance, but that does not necessarily translate to what's going to happen in the future. Congress could always change the law, or the administration may decide to enforce the laws differently, so all of these things are subject to change. The National War Tax Resistance Coordinating Committee, which is sponsoring these webinars, is a coalition of groups around the United States that's been working for about 35 years now to help people who are refusing to pay for war, and also to help sort of organize the movement and make sure that the institutional memory of the movement is preserved. They do a very good job of this. That's their website address right there. They've got lots of good information. Myself, I've been resisting federal income tax and other federal taxes since the launch of the war on Iraq in 2003. I also blog about tax resistance topics at my blog called The Picket Line, and I'm the author of some books, an editor of some books about tax resistance. You can find these on Amazon or order them from your favorite bookstore. All right, so here's the situation we find ourselves in and why tax resistance is important right now in particular. So you read in the headlines all of these terrible things that are going on. And what this really amounts to is the continuation and the acceleration of what was already a pretty rotten policy. When you look at the budget, federal budget of the United States, the discretionary budget in particular, it's enormously militarized. The U.S. spends as much on what it tries to call defense, but really is sort of an offensive military, than the next 9 countries combined. We are the world's highest incarceration rate. Our police militarization is just bizarre and out of control. I saw a statistic the other day that said the New York Police Department spends more on its military than half the countries in NATO, which is astonishing. So Trump's budget is terrible, but it's really just sort of accelerating and expanding what was already a fairly awful budget to begin with. And so this is not only a terrible thing, it's a problem for all of us. Because as taxpayers, we're being called upon to participate in and perpetuate this terrible thing. And it's up to us to stop. We have to stop rowing the ship of state, otherwise it's going to continue to crash into people. So we have to go from refusing our moral support and refusing our rhetorical support to refusing our practical support, and that's where tax resistance comes in. So we've been in the war tax resistance community, we've been resisting war and militarism for a long time through tax resistance, but now with all of the other terrible things the Trump administration is doing, there's a new generation of tax resistors who are coming along who are motivated by other concerns, who don't really put militarism and war at the top of their list, but still feel like they need to withhold their money from the Trump administration because of all the other terrible things it's doing. So I'm going to try to, in this presentation, speak to both of these groups. Some of the things I'm going to say are very specific to the long-standing war tax resistance tradition in the United States, but most of these are also going to be useful for people who are resisting for any reason at all. Tax resistance is a particularly good form of protest and dissent, and these are some of the reasons why. It's practical. You can measure in dollars and cents the effect you're having. If you paid your taxes, you would have been supporting the Trump policies that much. If you refuse to pay, you're withholding that much support from them. You can measure that. It's very deliberate. It's not just a spontaneous display. It's not something that arises and goes away. It's a deliberate engagement with the facts around you. It's an ongoing commitment. So it's a direct action that you do on a constant basis, which is, I think, very attractive. It's not just a sort of instantaneous thing that may or may not have any effect. It's an ongoing thing. It also reminds you constantly that you're in the resistance. It's a controlled form of resistance. You can anticipate the risks ahead of time. You can control for those risks. You can adjust the way that you resist over time as your lifestyle changes, as your goals change, as the government changes its tactics of dealing with resistance. It's something that you can start right now. You don't have to wait for a critical mass. You don't have to wait for a charismatic leader. You don't have to wait for the next election. You can start resisting immediately. It's active in that it's something that you get to do. It's not, you're not begging politicians in Washington to do the right thing. You're not writing letters to Congress hoping that they'll do the right thing. You're doing the right thing yourself. It's conscientious. If you ask people who have been resisting for a while, that you will come to understand how important this is, that you have a firm foundation under you when you're engaging in political action, direct action, conscientious objection. If you're paying taxes to the same government that you're protesting, you feel kind of divided, you feel split. There's a sort of schizophrenia about it, where on the one hand you're supporting with the other hand you're protesting. And when you start withdrawing your support, it really gives you a much firmer base from which you can do any other action that you're doing. So tax resistance has a long history. Here are some of the highlights of that history. The war tax resistance movement in the United States is something that has been in America since before there was a United States. The Quakers have been resisting war taxes here since we were colonies. If you ask the people who were doing the American Revolution, when the revolution happened, it was long before the shots were fired at Lexington and Concord. They believed that the revolution happened in the tax resistance movement, in the organization that was leading to the Continental Congress, and so on and so forth. It was a nonviolent revolution. And then what we think of as the American Revolution was more of a counter-revolution. So our origin as a nation was in a tax resistance movement. Tax resistance was used by the women's suffrage movement, particularly in England, but also to a lesser extent in the United States. The Salt March, Gandhi's Salt March, was a tax resistance movement. Why was he gathering salt? Because the British colonial government had a monopoly on it, and that monopoly allowed them to tax it, and that's how they funded the occupation. In the Vietnam War, war tax resistance became a very big thing. There were hundreds of thousands of people who were refusing to pay their taxes because of the Vietnam War, and that helped to lead to the American government's eventual conclusion that they'd lost the support of the American people and ended to the end of the war. The Thatcher regime in Great Britain, their collapse came from a grassroots tax resistance movement, people who were refusing to pay the poll tax. And this was something that was not led by labor, it wasn't led by political parties, it wasn't led by institutional groups. It was very much a grassroots protest that built steam and ended the regime. More recently, the Occupy movement in the United States sort of came and went and had its moment. But in Spain, shortly before it started here, there was a very similar movement. And they aligned themselves with war tax resistors in Spain and came up with an interesting new way of sort of combining the movements, which was to have people in Occupy refuse to pay their taxes to the federal government there, and instead give that money to projects that were launched by the Occupy-style assemblies or to the assemblies themselves to keep perpetuating that democratic and grassroots and self-organized economy. And that's a tradition we're trying to sort of get launched here in the United States too. It's got a lot of promise to it. So let's look at where the United States federal government gets its tax money. What you can see over in this chart on the right is that the bulk of it is that green block there, and that's all the federal income tax on individuals. So that's your 1040 form at the end of the year. That's what that represents. The corporate income tax is a much smaller slab, And then there's that light blue bar at the top, that's employment taxes. So that would be on your paycheck, that would be FICA. If you're self-employed, that's the self-employment tax that you file quarterly. And that's also a pretty big hunk. I think most Americans pay more in employment taxes than they do in income taxes. Not on this chart here is borrowing. As you know, we've been running a deficit in the United States for a long time, and deficit spending is an important part of the budget, and that money comes from borrowing. And the way you can resist that as an individual is not to buy US government bonds, and that can be kind of tricky. A lot of people have US bonds in their retirement accounts, for instance, and just don't know it. So it's worthwhile to review from time to time if you've got an IRA or a 401k or something like that. Look at where those are being invested and make sure that none of those investments are going into government bonds, because that's just giving the government money to spend on terrible things. So when you're deciding what kind of resistance method to use, and there are many of them, war tax resistors use a great variety of tax resistance methods, it's important to understand ahead of time, what are your goals? What are you trying to accomplish with your resistance? What are you willing to risk? Different methods have different things that they risk doing. What values you want to support. So for instance, if it's important to you that you do your resistance in an honest and open way, that you not practice any sort of deception, then you're going to want to, file all of your returns correctly and make, not earn money in the underground economy and do sneaky things like that. On the other hand, if your main value is to make sure that the government doesn't get any of your money to spend, then you may be willing to do some of those things, and being open and honest with the government isn't a value that you have. So knowing your values ahead of time will help you pick your tactics. And your life situation. That'll depend if you have dependents, if you're retired, if you're self-employed, if you've got a lot of debt. There's all things that are going to influence which methods you choose. But the good news is there's lots of them. It makes tax resistance kind of complicated to explain because there isn't really a one-size-fits-all solution. On the other hand, it's very flexible. Depending on what your life situation is, what your values, your goals, and so forth, there is a method that's right for you. Today I'm going to talk about two of the common families of methods. And there are methods other than these, but these are two that are very frequently encountered in war tax resistance circles. One is to refuse to pay some of your income tax and either file or not file. And the other is to earn less than the taxable income. And I'll talk about these in a little bit more detail. So if you're employed by somebody else, taxes are going to be withheld from your paycheck. Each check is going to have a certain amount withheld from it. The amount that gets withheld depends on the W-4 form that you filed with your employer. So the way to stop that withholding, or to reduce that withholding, so that you have taxes to resist at the end of the year, is to file a new W-4 that increases the number of allowances on the form. So you can do this at any time. It's not weird or suspicious. Employees do this all the time. And it isn't the sort of thing where you are declaring how many exemptions you have or how many dependents you have. It's specifically called allowances. And all that is a method of adjusting your withholding. There's a pamphlet that Newtrick puts out. They're the first pamphlet in their Practical War Tax Resistance series that goes through the steps, step by step, of determining how many allowances you would want to take on your W-4 form in order to stop withholding entirely or reduce it to a level where you'll have some to resist at the end of the year. When you do this, less or none will be withheld from your paycheck, and then when you file your 1040 at the end of the year, you will owe money to the IRS. At that point, you get to decide, do I want to resist all of it? Do I want to resist some of it? Do I want to resist a symbolic amount of it? But it gives you that choice. If too much is withheld from your paycheck, that's like giving an interest-free loan to the government. At the end of the year, they'll owe you money, and it reduces your opportunities to resist. So it's important that if you're employed and you want to do tax resistance, that you do this right away, that you should, when you go into work tomorrow, ask for a W-4 form and file a new one. This is what it looks like. It's line 5 on this W-4 form is what you would want to change, and add the number of allowances. It's a small form, doesn't take long to fill out. If you're self-employed, on the other hand, you don't have money withheld from your paycheck. You just get money from your clients, and they don't do any withholding. You're supposed to, every quarter, file a return that pays a quarter of your estimated taxes through the year. So that would be a quarter of both your federal income tax and your self-employment tax, the equivalent of FICA for self-employed people. It's possible that when you started working for a client that you filled out a W-9 form, and that client will then file a 1099 form with the IRS telling them how much money that they paid you. If so, the IRS will know about this and will expect you to put it on your return. Some people try to work under the table and not get 1099s, not file W-9s, and try to work in such a way that the IRS never determines that they've gotten any income at all. And this enables them to, if they choose to, not file a return or file a return that excludes that income from their income, and then they're not going to be paying taxes on it, and they hope that the IRS will never catch up with them. So the question of whether you want to file or not file involves a lot of factors, and here are some of them. When you file, you're going to be sending an accurate form to the IRS. Maybe you're going to send a letter of protest along with it, but I don't recommend that, actually. I'll tell you why later. And when you do this, you're going to be telling the IRS what your income was and what the income sources were. You may be telling them details about your retirement accounts and things like that. All of these things potentially help the IRS collect from you later on, and so that's a disadvantage of filing. On the other hand, there are some advantages of filing. One is that once you file your tax return, the IRS has 10 years at that point to collect. If they don't collect the money on that tax return in 10 years, it falls off the statute of limitations, and they can no longer collect it at all. And this is an experience that a lot of poor tax resistors have, where the IRS, sends them nasty letters for 10 years, but never manages to quite catch up with them, and then the tax debt goes away. If you don't file, there's no statute of limitations, and the IRS can come after you 10, 20, 30 years down the line and still try to get those taxes from an ancient year. Some other advantages of filing is that it enables you to apply for Obamacare credits for health insurance. Sometimes when you apply for scholarships or subsidies, higher education subsidies, things like that, they will ask you to come in with a copy of your tax return and use that to determine your income and your eligibility. So that could be an advantage of filing. On the other hand, if you don't file, it's usually to your advantage to go ahead and fill out the forms, even if you don't plan on filing them. And there's two reasons. One is because sometimes those scholarships and other eligibility determinations will allow you to use those forms even if you don't file them. And the other is, if the IRS ever catches up to you after you've not been filing, it will respond by filing a return on your behalf, but it's not going to go around hunting for deductions and credits that you're eligible for. It's just going to look at the income it thought you earned and the taxes it thinks you ought to pay on it. And so if they do that, it can then be to your advantage to file a return and say, no, this is the return how it should have been with all my deductions and credits, because that might lower your taxes. So not filing, it's possible that that'll make it harder for the IRS to collect simply because they have less information on you. On the other hand, if your employer is filing W-2s, or your clients are filing 1099s, or your banks are filing reports about your interest or your dividends or things like that with the IRS, then they kind of already know you exist, and they already know that you're getting income, and they'll already be interested in you. Another problem with not filing, the penalties are much more severe. The financial penalties start much higher and ramp up much higher when you don't file than when you don't pay. And the possibility of criminal penalties is higher if you don't file. So advantages and disadvantages to both. And it's worth knowing ahead of time which are, that's set so you can decide which risks you're willing to take. Getting below the income tax line is a different family of methods. It's surprisingly easy to do. About 44% of American households are already living below the federal income tax line. A lot of people don't know that. But that represents about 35% of the people who file taxes are already below the federal income tax line. So the way to do that is to reduce your taxable income and qualify for tax credits. You reduce your taxable income by taking some of your income out of the taxable category. You do that by putting money in tax-deferred accounts and things of that sort. And you try to qualify for tax credits that reduce the tax itself. You then find out at what level your tax will get to zero, and recalibrate your life, basically, so that at that income level, at that amount of money you can spend, you're going to be comfortable. Newtrick has a great pamphlet on this, too. All of these pamphlets are available for free on their website. They have a pamphlet on low-income, simple living and poor tax resistance that goes through step-by-step how to go about doing this, gives you a lot of good resources on simple living, and a lot of ideas on how to use tax credits and tax deductions well. Every time I talk about tax resistance, particularly with reporters or with people who are completely unfamiliar with it, or people respond to me on Twitter, there are always a certain number of myths about tax resistance that comes up. So I want to tackle these right off the bat. And if there are other questions that you have, we're going to be having a question and answer session at the end, and I'll answer anything else that comes at me. But anyway, these are 4 of the most common myths that come up, and I'm tackling them one by one. First is, if I refuse to pay, they're going to throw me in jail. And that's just completely unlikely. Here I'm going to show you some numbers that I think will convince you why. So every year, lots of people file their taxes and don't send the money in, or don't send enough money in. Not all of them are protesters. Not all of them are acting from direct action motives. A lot of them are just people who don't have the money right then. They're behind, and they're hoping they can catch up later, or they just forgot to put the check in. Anyway, so lots of people don't pay all their taxes at the end of the year. It's not just a handful of stubborn people like us. So for instance, in 2016, there were over 7 million people who didn't pay their taxes at the end of the year. And there were another 1 million who didn't bother to file their taxes at all, but the IRS knew that they should have. All right. The IRS criminally prosecuted 2,761 people that year and managed to convict most of them and sentence them to things like jail or home detention. But that's that little red line at the bottom of the screen. And zoom in, that's how many people they actually went after with criminal penalties. So the likelihood of actually going to jail for refusing to pay taxes is really, really small. Over the past 75 years or so, there have been 2 people in the war tax resistance movement out of tens of thousands of people who have refused to pay, who've actually gone to jail simply for not paying their taxes. There have been a few others who've gone behind bars for contempt of court, or for filing their tax returns in some weird protesting manner, or failure to file. Some of them have gone to jail for failure to file. But if you just file and don't pay, and you go to jail, you'd be number 3. There just aren't that many people who suffer that sort of consequence. It doesn't happen very much. The other myth is that the IRS is going to take your house and property. And that didn't used to be a myth. It used to be something that happened occasionally. But in 1999, the IRS really just sort of decided it wasn't going to be in the business of seizing people's homes and cars very much. Most of the time it happens today, it's coincident with like a big drug dealer takedown sort of thing, where they're seizing the person's I don't know, army of Corvettes and their mansion and so on and so forth, and the IRS then gets involved and participates in the auction. But the last time they tried to seize a car or a house from a war tax resistor was in the late 90s, and there hasn't been anything like that since. So they could change their policy again. They could bring this back as a tactic. There's nothing stopping them from doing it. But right now, it's really not a concern. Another myth is that if you don't pay your taxes, the IRS is just going to add penalties and interest to what you owed. And then when they eventually seize it, they'll end up with more money in the end. And so you will have ironically ended up supporting the government more by trying not to support them at all. And this is not entirely mythical, but it is a myth, and I'll tell you why. In any particular case, it's possible that the IRS will do just that. that it will apply penalties and interest to the money that you owe, and it will eventually figure out a way to get it from you by seizing it from your bank account or taking it out of your paycheck or something like that. However, in the aggregate, money that people refuse to pay to the IRS does not get collected eventually. This pie chart shows the total amount that the IRS thinks Americans owe them and didn't pay them. A lot of it they just write off immediately because the person that owes the tax is dead, or they've left the country, or they can't be found, or they're permanently disabled and they're never going to have an income again, or for whatever reason they decide it's just they're never going to get their hands on it. Another big hunk of it, they just think it's going to be too much trouble. It's not going to be worth the time and effort. The IRS is very underfunded right now. They've lost a lot of employees over the last decade. They just don't have the manpower to go after it. And those of us in the war tax community are feeling this. We're getting a lot less actual enforcement attention. A lot more of what the IRS is doing to us now is just sending us letters. And it's because they're overworked, they're underfunded, they've been given a lot of new responsibilities with Obamacare in particular. Also, there's a lot of fraud going on where there are call centers around the world who have people who are impersonating IRS agents to try to extort money from people in the US. And so the IRS is having to be on top of that and to try to combat that. And they weren't given any more funding or personnel to do it. So basically, they're just in a bad shape. That green wedge on the chart is the only part of all of the money that they think is owed by Americans that they actually expect to collect, that they include in their financial statements as potential income. And in the war tax resistance movement, we have personal experience with this too. We did a survey at a national conference a few years ago and asked people there how much they had resisted over the years and how much the IRS had successfully collected. And it was something like this pie chart. It was a small fraction of what had been resisted over time that the IRS had managed to get their hands on. In my case, I've resisted a little over $50,000, and the IRS has gotten their hands on about $6,000 of it. So typically, no. And in the aggregate, no, this is a myth. In any particular case, it might be true. The last of these myths is that war tax resistors are being selfish, that they're not paying for things that society needs, they're not being pro-social. And in fact, war tax resistors very typically will take the money that they didn't give to the government and give it to people who need it more, instead of trying to contribute to society by funneling their money through the Trump administration. They give it directly to the places where it's needed. And so I think this is more than a myth, it's the opposite of the truth. Those of you who are listening from Northern California either know about or are probably going to hear about today the Northern California War Tax Resistance Project, the People's Life Fund, which is where war tax resistors in the Bay Area aggregate the taxes that they refuse to give to the government and then give giveaways of some of those funds to local groups who are doing good things. So these are the myths about what the risks are and what values are being violated and so on and so forth. I'll talk a little bit now about what the actual risks are. So first off, if you file and refuse to pay, the IRS is going to send you a letter. And it's going to say, where was the check? And then after a while, it's going to send you another letter. It'll probably have an exclamation mark in it and some boldface and say, hey, where's the check? And then they'll send you another letter saying, if you don't send the check, we're going to try to garnish your wages or go after your bank account or something like that. And then they might actually do that. This takes a matter of months for them to go through this process of sending letters. It's also very possible that sending letters is all they do, that they don't get around to trying to hunt for your bank account simply because they're overworked. So bank account seizure, salary garnishment, Social Security garnishment, they can take up to 15% of your Social Security check automatically. If they go through a long and complicated process, they can even take more of it than that. They have to leave you a certain amount of money to live on, but it's not very much. So those are possible risks. If you decide to live under the tax line, the risks are mostly financial. Do you have enough money to live on? Can you get by on that much? And I encourage you to do the math because it's probably much more than you think it is. You can earn quite a bit and still be under the tax line. The interest and penalties are a real risk. The IRS will add interest and penalties to what you don't pay. Nutric has pamphlets that explain the whole process and how much interest and penalties will be paid or will be added over time. It depends on the current interest rate. I have an asterisk there, and I'll tell you why in the next slide. Also, there's a frivolous filing penalty. And earlier, I encouraged you not to send a letter of protest with your tax return, and this is why. The IRS has the power to tack a $5,000 penalty on people for frivolous filing, which is something it defines, and it gets to decide. It doesn't have to go to court first, and if it applies that penalty to you, you have to pay it in order to appeal it. It's kind of catch-22 situation. So when do they give you the frivolous filing penalty? It's designed for the sort of people who say that the 16th Amendment to the Constitution wasn't really ratified because Ohio wasn't really a state, or the IRS isn't really a government agency, or the income tax really only applies to federal employees or people who are living in Washington, D.C. There are all these kind of weird arguments that are floating around. And this is designed to hit people who try to bring those arguments up and say that I don't have to pay taxes because of some weird interpretation of the law. If you file a letter of protest with your tax return, the IRS may interpret that as taking one of these frivolous positions and may hit you with this penalty. They're not supposed to. If you file an accurate return, even if you file a letter of protest with it, they're not supposed to give you this penalty, but they're not always on the ball about that. And because you have to pay it in order to appeal it, it can be very risky. So I recommend if you want to file a letter of protest about your taxes, that you don't send it to the IRS, you send it to your congressperson, you send it to the president, you send it to letter to the editor, or something like that. It just makes the risk of getting one of these mistaken frivolous filing penalties less. You run the risk if you do tax resistance by not filing of not being able to apply for those Obamacare health insurance subsidies, if that's important for you. The difficulty in getting student loans also has to do with not filing. If you don't file, then you might not be able to prove your eligibility for scholarships and student loans. There's a new law that's just going into effect this year that says if you owe $50,000 or more in unpaid taxes, the IRS is supposed to notify the State Department, and the State Department is then authorized to take your passport away. Nobody's experienced this yet because it's so new, but it's something that is kind of on the horizon and is threatening some of us. I just rose over the 50K mark this year, so I'm sort of nervously anticipating a letter from the State Department saying they're going to take my passport away. So we don't know the extent of this risk yet, how much they're going to be enforcing this, but this is another thing that's a possible risk for people resisting over the long term or resisting large amounts. It's also possible that the IRS will file a lien against you if you owe them taxes. If they do this, then it becomes more difficult to apply for loans. So for instance, if you're trying to buy a house or something like that, they will notice that the IRS has a lien and will be afraid to loan you money because the IRS might step in and take any money that you get. This is not particularly common. The IRS has the power to file these public liens, but doesn't seem to do it very often. I checked my credit report a while back expecting to see one on there, and there wasn't one. And so I apparently fall under the threshold of their interest in doing this. So here's the asterisk. It's the War Tax Resisters Penalty Fund, and this is a great program. So remember that one of the risks of not paying is that the IRS is going to be adding penalties and interest to what you owe, and it's possible that they will end up seizing it from you at some point if they find your bank account or garnish your salary. And so then it's possible that you'll be out more money than you would have been if you paid the taxes in the first place. This is where the War Tax Resisters Penalty Fund comes in. It's a crowd-served way of reimbursing a resistor for those penalties and interest. So here's how it works. The IRS manages to seize money from you. You turn out to be one of the unlucky ones. And they seize the taxes and they seize the penalties and interest. You contact the War Tax Resisters Penalty Fund. And you tell them about this, you send them the documentation, whatever the paperwork the IRS sent you. You also document the fact that you're doing this for conscientious war tax resistance reasons. This is something that's not yet open to, say, anti-Trump tax resistors. So they'd have to organize their own, or the War Tax Resistors Penalty Fund would have to change its policies. Right now, it's only for war tax resistors. So you send the fund the documentation of how much was seized and how much is attributable to penalties and interest. They then divide that up among all the subscribers to the fund and send out a letter to all of them saying, please chip in to help pay this war tax resistors penalties and interest. They send in their money, and then the War Tax Resistors Penalty Fund reimburses the resistor for 100% of the penalties and interest that they lost. So that means you personally are not going to be out any more than you would have if you paid your taxes in the first place. You only have to pay the original tax amount. So it's a way of making sure that people are not going to be reluctant to resist because they're afraid of the financial penalties. It takes that away. And they're a really good group. I've donated to them in the past. I got a reimbursement from them at one point. They're real solid. So this is one example of where the organized war tax resistance movement helps people to resist, and there's lots more, and you can find out more about them from Neutrich's website. It has all sorts of information on it. The practical series pamphlets are very, very helpful in helping to spell out the various methods of tax resistance. There's a newsletter that comes out every couple of months that gives you news about how the tax law is changing, how resistors are, what sort of experiences they're having with the government, what kind of actions they're doing, profiles of just who they are and why they're doing what they're doing, methods that people are adding, because there's always sort of new tweaks to the varieties of tax resistance. So it's a great way of just keeping your finger on the pulse of how this is done. And you can also learn about workshops in your area, and there are national gatherings that take place twice a year all over the country. You find out if there's one coming up near you, you can go, and those are fantastic ways of tapping into the institutional knowledge and memory of this group. There's also a list of war tax resistance counselors across the country, and so you can find a counselor in your area and sit down and have a one-on-one with them about your particular situation and help to craft your particular method of war tax resistance, or you can call them up. So there's lots of great information on this Neutrich site. I really recommend that you check it out. All right, so now I'm at the end of the portion of sort of my presentation portion, and I'd like to open it up to questions and answers. So if anybody's got a question, please raise your hand or type it in. Ryan.
Okay.
That's you.
Hi, Dave. It's actually Martha Kane.
Oh, hi, Martha.
Hi, from Northern California. This is not a question about the methods so much, but it occurred to me while you were speaking, and by the way, great presentation, that what we need to do as a war tax resistance movement is what we did on last Saturday, which is go to events and flyer about war tax resistance, and then follow it up a week after with a workshop. And I know that this one is being taped and or recorded so that we can use it again in the future, so we wouldn't always need to depend on you. But I just wanted to kind of float that out there as a regular idea, because I see it as a great way to get momentum going. And I think having people gather and listen together is a more supportive environment to promote that in. So it's more of a sort of a, like, do you agree, and how available might you be, or just a general suggestion.
Yeah, I think that's a great idea. You get people together and they can gab afterwards, and talk and try to craft things or ask questions amongst each other. It's a lot more motivating, I think.
My name's Claudia. I'm also in Northern California. I have a question kind of from more of a philosophical perspective, which is I understand sort of the tactical reason why one would want to send a letter to the IRS declaring the reasons for not paying taxes. I guess I'm just kind of wondering philosophically how you personally or other folks in the movement that you can talk to describe the distinction between that and maybe somebody who is resisting paying their taxes for other reasons. Say, for example, somebody who chooses not to pay taxes because they don't want to support Planned Parenthood, or abortions, for example, and how does that also inform the tactics as well?
I followed the tax resistance movements around the world pretty closely, and I don't see very much evidence that there are tax resistance movements and tax resistors who are motivated by things like abortion or very many other things. It's typically pacifism, anti-war that motivates tax resistors, or there are tax resistance for sort of nonviolent resistance, trying to take down a government or prevent a government from being able to do the terrible things it's doing. There are a few individual resistors who are resisting from a sort of pro-life perspective, but there's never been anything that I've seen that's more than a handful of people scattered all over the world. So those do exist, but they're fairly rare. And the motivation and the philosophical perspective behind it is very similar to the war tax resistors. There's something that the government is doing that they don't feel like they can be responsible for themselves. They feel like paying for it with their taxes makes them responsible, and so they feel like they must stop. So it's rhetorically and philosophically, it's a very similar position.
I have two questions if there's time, but I'll start with the first one. A follow-up for that one is that, I mean, I do hear about a lot of people who are wealthy and want to resist taxes to keep being wealthy. And I guess like sort of following up on Claudia's question, how do we look different to the IRS than people who are resisting just to keep more money?
I think to the IRS, we're not different. The IRS just considers war tax resistors to be tax evaders, and that's their official position. They consider it a frivolous position if we were to try to say that legally we don't need to pay these taxes because of Nuremberg principles or for any other reason. They don't consider us to be anything special in that regard. So what makes us special is the fact that we have certain convictions and that we express them. We express them in different ways. Myself, I don't send letters to Congress. I don't send letters to the IRS. I think of that as kind of a waste of time. I don't think they care what I think, and I don't care to tell them what I think. I decide I want to do something. I want to be active. I want to stop paying, and that's the message that I'm sending to them. But a lot of people do send in letters, and they explain in detail. This is my conscientious stand. They're making a declaration. And that's important to them, and that's totally worthy of respect. As for the distinction between us and people who are just evading for self-interested reasons, in my opinion, if I hear about somebody who is fabulously wealthy and manages not to pay any taxes, I celebrate. I think that if that fabulously wealthy person spends that money on ski vacations and fancy cars and what have you, that money is still being better spent than the federal government would spend half of it on the military and a bunch of it on Trump's wall and all these other horrible things. So while that person may not be being entirely pro-social or supportive of society, I think he's being less harmful than he would be if he were going ahead and paying taxes. That's just my opinion, but there you have it.
But if the federal government has less money, is it more likely that they'll cut social programs before cutting military?
I can only speculate. I think you're probably right. When the government has more money, it wants to spend more money on war, and when it has less money, it still wants to spend more money on war, and that's a terrible thing. But it's not going to get less terrible by us giving the government more money. They're still going to have those terrible priorities. And at least we can not participate in that ourselves. We can, with our money, make sure that we're spending it on things that match our values. And by giving it to the government, we know that they're going to spend it on things that match their values. And that's just a really inefficient way of funding those few good things that the government does.
Dave, this is Martha again.
Wait.
Go ahead.
Okay.
Hi, Dave. It's Martha again. So I haven't yet composed my letter to my representatives because actually I do think that's a good thing for me to do. And part of the reason I think it's a good thing for me to do is that it helps me articulate kind of my position and where I'm coming from, and solidifies my resistance to the way we're spending our money. So it's like an exercise for me in doing that. So I'm going to do that. But one of the things that Susan mentioned earlier in the tax season is that she noted that since the late 80s, the portion of our military, the portion of our budget that goes to the military had actually dropped. Can you reflect on that a little bit? Do you agree with that statement, or has it just been calculated in a different way? What can you say about like the military portion in the 80s that I think was up to about 64%, and now we're looking at more like 44%.
I think it's gone up since then from 44, and certainly Trump's budget has boosted it quite a bit. So now it's a little bit closer to 50-50 in the discretionary spending. But yeah, I think it did drop since the Reagan era.
Sorry, that last number you said that you thought it had gone up to how much?
I think it's getting close to about 50-50 now, but that depends on the extent to which Trump's budget is going to be enacted as he requests it. There are some people in Congress who want to boost military spending even beyond what Trump did. So we don't know yet really what the numbers are going to be. But yeah, I think it did drop from the Reagan buildup, military buildup times to recent times. And a lot of that, I think, has to do with, or we're spending more money on debt and we're spending more money on salaries and pensions and things like that. In real numbers, the military budget has really gone up, but in terms of a percentage of the federal budget as a whole, it's dropped a bit. But it's still gargantuan.
Yeah, keep talking. I think you can still.
Dave, I have one more question. This is Susan. And in doing a little research this year, I was very surprised to learn that 8 out of 10 U.S. tax filers actually overpay and then expect a refund, and that amounts to $300 billion a year in money that the federal government has as interest-free loans to use as they please for border walls and militarization of our police and wars abroad. And it seems to me that simply taking an extra W-4 allowance, given that reality that how many people are overpaying, that by simply lowering that amount in any way, shape, or form, that's a fairly risk-free way to send a powerful message to the government. I'm wondering if you could say anything more about that.
Sure, yeah. In fact, this is a good way of doing outreach to people who are not necessarily war tax resistors, not necessarily all that concerned about government or protest. There's a very self-interested reason not to want to give the government an interest-free loan all year long. People, I think, when they file their returns at the end of the year and get a refund, they think sort of they won the lottery. They think it's, you know, it's a really lucky and fortuitous and wonderful thing, but it really just represents that you've been a sucker. You've given money to the government as an interest-free loan all year long, and if you'd instead taken that money and put it in an interest-bearing account, you'd come out ahead. So being able to reach out to people in general and say everybody should be filing new W-4 forms. The way those forms are now, they're kind of rigged to get you to withhold more than you need to, and that's why so many people get refunds at the end of the year. So many people overpay. So just encouraging people, no, go ahead and file a new W-4, raise your allowances, you'll get more money in each paycheck, put that money away somewhere where it's going to earn you money, where it's going to do you good. Don't give it to the government and then get it back at the end of the year and think you've won. Yeah, it's a good way of doing outreach to people in general. And certainly is something that everybody in our movement should be doing. Everybody who wants to be a war tax resistor should definitely be going and filing this return right away to make sure that they're not one of these ones who's going to be getting a refund, and then you're kind of caught flat-footed at the end of the year. You don't really have an opportunity to resist.
So this might be a better question for an accountant, but I'm just going to ask it anyway, in case you know. Is it possible for a like more risk averse person basically to make enough in charitable contributions to file enough deductions on their taxes at the end of the year and resist in that way? Is that possible?
Good question. It turns out that's difficult to do. It's commonly thought that you can just give away enough money, and eventually you'll be at the point where you're not taxed. But the way the deduction for charitable contributions works makes it very difficult to do that well. For one thing, you only get to take about 50% of what you donate as a deduction. For another thing, those are itemized deductions, and so in order to deduct anything at all, you have to have given away enough money so that your itemized deductions are higher than your standard deduction. And then there are even further restrictions. There are some places where you can give charitable donations to, but you don't even get the 50%. So there's a lot of reasons why that doesn't work well. Also, some of the ways that you can get below the tax line require your adjusted gross income to be lower. And you can't really lower your adjusted gross income with charitable donations because your itemized deductions are taken after your adjusted gross income is calculated. And so you really would have to get down to a very, very low income level to make that work. So I encourage you to do the math and see what you can do, because you can certainly lower your taxes that way. But it's very hard to get to the point where you're fully resisting and not giving any money to the Trump administration simply through using charitable deductions, unfortunately.
If a person doesn't pay any of the penalties or anything, just isn't responsive to the IRS at all, doesn't give them the passport or something, do you know, like, if someone goes to jail for that, how long, like, the sentence could be if they, like, refuse to pay, or would they start seizing other things?
There's what the IRS can do, and then there's what it will do. And so, as you saw earlier in the presentation, of the tens of thousands of war tax resistors who have refused to pay over the years, there's only 2 people who have done time, and I think one of them did 10 months, I think was the longest one. And that's simply for not paying, for just refusing to pay, and then the IRS caught up with them and criminally charged them, which almost never happens, and took them and put them in jail for that. So there's what the IRS can do and what it will do. They can criminally charge anybody who willfully refuses to pay taxes. In our historical experience, that just never happens. They just don't do that. But they could decide to. And if they do decide to, they'll probably go after prominent people. They'll probably go after me because I've got a big internet presence and I do a lot of outreach and I try to encourage people to resist. But it's very rare that they do it. You can find out more about what the criminal penalties are. The IRS itself has a lot of information online. Newsweek has a lot of information online. But as a practical measure, the criminal penalties are not really something that you need to concern yourself about unless you're really going to seek them out. So when the IRS takes you to court, or if the IRS takes you to court, also a very rare thing, if you refuse to supply documents, if you refuse to answer the judge's questions, if you refuse to come to the courtroom, you could get criminal contempt, and the judge can throw you in prison for that. And that's happened to war tax resistors who just have had a non-cooperation policy that they've carried into the courtroom with them. If you take deductions on your tax returns that you're not qualified for, so if you're lying on your tax return as a way of resisting, the IRS may criminally charge you for that. That's much more common. If you refuse to file at all and the IRS catches up to you, there's a chance that they'll attach criminal charges to it. But for the person who files and doesn't pay, the IRS almost never uses criminal charges. It uses the civil process to try to seize money from you, and that's how they operate. And Berkeley again.
So after attending your last webinar and doing a lot of research on my own before that and after that, I thought I kind of understood everything or was starting to fairly well. And then something new came into my understanding, which is that self-employed people are supposed to file quarterly rather than just once at the end of the year. Can you speak more to that, and what's the deal with having to file 4 times throughout the year?
Yeah, if you're self-employed, you're supposed to file a quarterly return that gives an estimate of how much you earned that quarter, and that's what you use to pay both an estimate of your income tax and an estimate of your self-employment tax. There's no penalty for not filing that, but there is the penalty for not paying it is the same as for not paying income tax. It's, there'll be a certain amount of penalty at the end of the year when you file your income tax return, and a certain amount of interest that accumulates over time on that. So it's basically the same deal. So I'm self-employed, and that's my situation. Every quarter I'm supposed to file a return that includes information about how much I think I'm going to earn over the course of the year, divide that in the quarter, calculate the income tax on that, calculate the self-employment tax on that, and write them a check and send it in. And each quarter I just fail to do that. And at the end of the year, the IRS helpfully sends me a bunch of these forms and says, remember, you're supposed to do this, and I chuck them, and that's how I deal with it. But yeah, that's what it is for self-employed people. That's the supposedly your responsibility.
But you do file that one time at the end of the year. You just don't file the other 3 times throughout, correct?
Yeah. Yes.
Cool. And there's no penalty for just filing once at the end and not the 3 times in the middle.
Yeah. For some reason, they don't have an additional penalty for not filing the quarterlies. You just there's the penalty for there's a certain penalty for not having enough withheld over the course of the year, or not. Yeah, I guess let me put that another way. Because they expected to get a certain amount of money from you over the course of the year, there's a certain penalty that's basically just like a percentage of that amount, where they say, we could have been collecting interest on this money the whole time, and so instead we're going to penalize you a little bit at the end when you file your tax return. So for instance, last year I owed like $4,100, something like that, in self-employment tax, which I didn't pay over the course of the year. And so they're going to add probably about $100 to that, just in terms of the interest they should have been collecting on it over time. So there is a small penalty at the end, but it isn't like the failure to file penalty with failing to file a 1040, which is much more severe than that.
And can you still hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah. Feel free to refuse this question based on just not wanting to get too personal about it, but do you pay that self-employment tax, since that goes to Social Security and Medicare, and don't pay the income tax? Is that how you go about what you do? You pay the employment tax at the end of the year?
That's how I started. When I started doing tax resistance in 2003, is that I lowered my income below the income tax threshold, but continued to pay my self-employment tax. And then the more I looked into how Congress operates, I determined that that tax does not really go to Social Security or Medicare, that basically all that money is just going into one big pot somewhere, and Congress is spending it however it wants. So, for instance, when the Social Security Trust Fund was running a surplus, Congress just took all that money, borrowed it, and replaced it with bonds, and then spent it on war and militarism and terrible things. So I determined that in order to stop feeling like I was an accomplice in what the government was doing, I needed to not pay that money also. That is not the unanimous opinion of war tax resistors by any means. A lot of war tax resistors concentrate solely on the federal income tax, and they believe that the Social Security, Medicare programs are funded exclusively by FICA and by self-employment tax, and they don't have a problem with that, and so they're willing to go ahead and pay those funds. And so there's a difference of opinion as to whether it's cool to pay that money, or whether there's problems with paying that money. And back to Berkeley.
So I am interested in movement building, and I like the idea of war tax resistance because there is a collectiveness to the effort. But I just kind of have a question about kind of generally like the movement itself, and specifically how diverse the movement is. You mentioned earlier that there had been a conference and that there had been some surveys taken of people's past experiences in terms of what penalties they have incurred. But I'm curious to know if there's any data that's been collected on people who participate in the movement in terms of demographics. I identify as a person of color, and just knowing that taking any kind of risk, even a calculated risk for communities of color who are already criminalized or already targeted by state, local, and federal government for numerous other reasons, I can see that being a really challenging thing to ask people to do in terms of building this up as a movement. So I'm really curious to know if there is any information about how diverse this movement already is, and if not, or if there is, even if there is information about that, any information you can provide about, are there efforts to grow the movement in terms of racial diversity, in terms of any other forms of diversity?
I can try to speak to that. I don't really have the information at my fingertips. We did some surveys a few years back of people who are active in the movement. It's very difficult to get a good feel for who all is doing war tax resistance. We don't really know how many people are doing it. A lot of people are just individualists about it. They never feel the need to reach out to the movement. So it's very frequent that we will hear about somebody in the news who has been resisting for years and years and years, but we've never heard of them before. They've never come to a Nutrik gathering or anything like that. So knowing what our demographics are is kind of a difficult art. We have a lot of diversity of tactics. Whether we have diversity of demographics, I don't know. I think war tax resistance is a particular responsibility of the privileged and the affluent, partially because the privileged and the affluent pay for more of the government. They are responsible more for that spending. As I said earlier in the presentation, about 44% of Americans are living underneath the tax line, the federal income tax line already, and most of this is just because they're poor. They don't make a whole lot of money. And so I think the war tax resistance movement probably is better off reaching out to the affluent and the privileged and saying, it's your responsibility, you need to do this. And if our demographics start to skew in that direction, I think maybe that's a sign of success, that what we're doing is we're reaching out to the people who need to be reached out to. We're recruiting resistors from the people who were formerly most responsible for the military spending. Again, this is my personal opinion, and not the opinion of Nutrik or the opinion of the movement in general, but that's where I stand. Any more hands from Berkeley or elsewhere? All right. Thanks so much for attending, and I think I got this recording this time, so this is going to be made available to people to review later on or to show to other people later on. Thanks so much for joining us, and I hope you have some time to talk amongst yourselves as well.